Good morning, everyone. We're just giving people a minute or so to jump on, and we'll get started very shortly. If you're just joining us, we're just giving folks a minute or so to join, and we will get started in a minute or so. Okay, I'm going to get things rolling while people continue to join, since we have quite a bit of content to cover in about an hour. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on building fire-adapted communities, a roadmap for California leaders. My name is Melissa Keene. I'm going to be your host and moderator today, and I'm a director with ILG. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. Right now, we're obviously doing a quick welcome. And then we're going to hear presentations from our panelists today, John Holtzman and Dave Winnacker. And then we will hear from you all. We'll have some audience Q&A towards the end of today's session. And then we will wrap up and adjourn by noon. Just a quick housekeeping note, as you joined, you probably noticed that you're muted, and you will be muted for the duration of today's webinar, but that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will be monitoring that Q&A box throughout today's webinar. We'll be responding to questions that are logistical in nature or anything that you need there, and then we'll be pulling all of your substantive questions to moderate during that Q&A that I mentioned towards the end of today's session. And then we will be recording today's webinar, and we'll be sharing that recording shortly after the webinar, along with this slide deck and other materials as needed. Before we jump in, I want to share just a little bit about the Institute for Local Government, in case you're not familiar with us. We are a statewide nonprofit and are affiliated with the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work with these local agencies to provide practical and easy to use resources so that you all as local agencies can more effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways. We provide a lot of education and training like this webinar, but we also provide longer format training and in-person training. But in addition to that, we also do technical assistance, capacity building services. We have a host of online resources, and we also provide convening services to local agencies statewide. And we do that in a number of different issue areas. So we have a program focused on leadership and governance. So some of the basics on how you all work as local agencies and can work together with each other and work with your community. We have a program focused on workforce development and civics education, so helping address some of the recruitment and retention challenges and build that pipeline into public service. We have a program focused on public engagement, so helping agencies do that in a more proactive and strategic manner. And then lastly, on sustainable and resilient communities. So thinking about tackling these big issues like housing and land use, and that's where this topic fits into our programmatic offerings as well, in terms of that readiness and mitigation in the wildfire space. So I do want to make a quick note that this is just the beginning of the conversation. So today's webinar is only an hour, and there's no way we could tackle this entire topic in just an hour. So this is the first in a series of 4 webinars that will bite off different pieces of this conversation as we go. So you see the different topics on the screen there, as well as the dates for those upcoming webinars. And registration is now open, so feel free to sign up for those additional topics either today or later in the year. And I do also want to make a note, we got a number of really fantastic questions ahead of today's session, and I'm sure we'll get a number of additional questions throughout today's conversation, but some of them may be more related to these upcoming topics. So if we don't get to your question today, it may be because it's a topic we're going to be covering later in this series, or we may just not have time to get to every single question that we have come in. So just want to set that stage right now, but definitely know that there'll be more opportunity to have conversation and more opportunity to learn about these very important topics as we move through this series. So with that, I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to get into our content for the day. So I'm joined today by Jonathan Holtzman, who's the founding partner at Renne Public Law Group and a longtime partner of ILG, and Dave Winnacker, who's a retired fire district chief and now works with RPMG, which is the consulting management side of Renne Public Law Group space. So I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Dave to kick off our conversation.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate it. It's good to see so many people on the call today. As Melissa alluded to, John Holtzman and I worked together during my time as the fire chief at the Moraga-Orinda Fire Protection District for 7 years, where we worked through a number of things as we tried to identify the path of least resistance and greatest effectiveness to achieve community wildfire adaptation and resilience. And if there's one theme that will carry out through today, it is that fire is a natural and recurring part of the California landscape. And any approach that does not recognize that is doomed to fail. Secondly, as we'll be alluding to, because we are talking about the risk posed to vulnerable communities by wildfire, there is a human aspect. And just as we must consider the physical terrain over which fire will move, we also must consider the human terrain over which wildfire risk reduction policy must move. And that's a theme you'll hear throughout. So without further ado, we'll get right into it. So the first question really is why are we here? Why is wildfire a topic of discussion in California and throughout the West? And it's pretty straightforward. First, we have an increase in fuel loading throughout the landscape. In forested areas, we have a legacy of logging and regrowth with forests as seen as plantations that sees an increase in tree density in the forested landscape from 30 to 60 several hundred years ago to upwards of 300 trees per acre in some areas now. We also, as a matter of national policy, following the Big Burn in 1910, we established fire exclusion policies throughout the West that disrupted the natural and recurring cycle of beneficial wildfire. In Mediterranean grass-covered landscapes, the pre-industrialization natural return interval was every 3 to 5 years, moving up to every 10 to 15 or so in forested landscape and 50 to 130 in southern coastal scrub. When we disrupted that natural fire return interval, we excluded fire, but we didn't exclude photosynthesis, and landscapes got out of balance as nature's equalizing mechanism in the form of wildfire was excluded. And then lastly, associated with that, we increased the efficacy of our firefighting resources. Following World War II, industrialized equipment and planning systems that came out of the mechanisms developed during the Second World War were used to mobilize very large, very effective firefighting resources, which is why from the late 40s and through the beginning of the 2000s, we saw a significant reduction in the number of acres burned per year throughout the West. And this was viewed as a victory as a success in taming the natural landscape to achieve an idealized future where there was never smoke in the air and there was never wildfire. And while that was effective for 50 some odd years, it carried forward all of that fuel load that would have otherwise been consumed in regular and low intensity beneficial fires. And all of that vegetative fuel load carried forward, and now it comes due in the form of a balloon payment on the worst possible day. So we have, in many ways, by relying on suppression, by logging a lot of trees, and then by building homes in fire-dependent landscapes without considering fire adaptation, we have set conditions for the loss we have seen recently. Which brings in my second sub-bullet there, the development of vulnerable communities. It is a true statement that homes in fire-dependent landscapes and in high fire and very high fire hazard severity zones have been lost at scale. It is not also a true statement that you cannot build in those areas. And so it's not that we have built homes in these areas, it's that we have built homes and we've sited them in neighborhoods and communities that did not properly consider wildfire risk reduction. And that comes it comes due both in the form the buildings are constructed prior to 2008 with the adoption of Chapter 7A of the California Building Code. We did not enforce a wildland urban interface building code. So homes built prior to 2008 have a significant number of vulnerabilities, where newer master planned communities that incorporate 7A are much more fire adapted and resilient. And then secondly, defensible space, the clearance of vegetation within 100 feet of a structure with an emphasis on the yet to be fully defined zone 0, that last 5 feet from 0 to 5 feet of a structure, where the ember resistant zone needs to be placed. Without those two factors, the building construction and the creation of effective defensible space, homes and the neighborhoods they constitute are highly vulnerable. We also see two things associated with climate change that are exacerbating our exposure to destructive wildfire. And the first is the increase of available vegetative fuel. And so what we see here is that it's not just the quantity of fuel, but it's the period at which that fuel, both the live and the dead fuel moistures, are low enough as a result of drought that they are available to burn. And then secondly, we see an increase in vapor deficit associated with atmospheric warming, meaning that less moisture is held in the ambient environment. Therefore, you have more of those days where fuel moistures are in the critical level. And then because of the compression of the rainy season and increase in temperature, we see more of the days that are both hot and dry and have high winds that are capable of supporting extreme fire behavior. And one note for those of you who are in a southern coastal shrub environment of Southern California, where we have excluded fire in many areas, we actually see too great a fire return interval in Southern California, where there's too much fire now on 26% of the FRA land. Same outcome, but different phenomena. And it's also, I think, really important to unpack which fires we're worried about. It is not generally very large, measured in number of acres burned, fires that are destroying communities. It is the initial operating periods of fast-moving, wind-driven fires that are associated with structure loss. This is work that comes out of research done by Jennifer Bulk and her colleagues at the University of Colorado that finds it is fast fires that are causing the loss of structures. And we see specifically in California, 50% of the structures lost since 2006 are associated with only 4 fires. And these are conflagrations where a wildland fire has initiated a subsequent urban fire, which is what we saw in Los Angeles in January, where it is no longer vegetation that is carrying the fire, it is now structures that are carrying the fire, which would then require a very different mitigation approach. So we're specifically focusing in on fast fires and those fast fires that have the ability to transition into an urban fire, where we can see structure to structure spread, and structures is the fuel most likely to carry the fire. One myth I would like to dispel right up front. You hear words such as the new normal or the pyrocene, et cetera. And I would just like to emphasize that specifically in California, this is not the new normal. This is the old normal. It's just back again. So in 2020, we saw 4.2 million acres burned. We had orange skies and we had endless numbers of articles and so forth were written about the new normal. And I would note, and this is drawing from work done by Dr. Scott Stevens and his colleagues at the University of California, that the historic annual fire area in California alone was 4.44 million acres per year. So in 2020, we got to the bottom end of the range of the pre-industrial fire occurrence. And I would also note that what burned in California per year at that time is 88% of what we burn now nationwide. So we have a massive fire deficit, not just in the West, but throughout the country, that is carrying forward vegetative fuel at quantities that set conditions for future extreme wildfires. And so just one note about vapor deficit, because I don't know how well this is understood, and it is certainly a discussion that should be had by all with regard to, is this going to get better or worse? So as the ambient environment and climate warms, as we see hotter days, we decrease the amount of water that can be carried in the air, which means our relative humidity at a higher temperature involves less water in the air. And why do we care about this? Because when we have drier, hotter days with less water, with increasing vapor pressure deficit, we start to see more fire. So on the left, we see the warm season mean vapor pressure deficit for, as we move over time, we see we're moving into hotter, drier days, that the column is not trending in the right direction. And on the right, we see the associated millions of acres burned directly tied to vapor pressure deficit. And as the chart makes clear, on those days that we have a higher vapor pressure deficit, we are more likely to see acres burnt, lots and lots of acres burnt. This chart continues to go up and to the right at either exponential or log normal growth rates, which do not bode well for the future fire activity we're likely to experience. Furthermore, not only are we experiencing fire loss, we're experiencing loss of availability of insurance coverage through the admitted markets. This is the FAIR plan. data going back to 2015. And you will note both not only the number of policies that are in force, how many homes that are being insured by the FAIR Plan, which is intended to be the insurance of last resort, but we also see a significant growth in the market share. I will note that this is as of March of 2025 and does not yet fully include the impact of the LA fires, which are likely to significantly increase this trend line moving up and to the right as more homes are unable to find coverage in the admitted market. The implications of the insurance market inability to provide coverage through the admitted market to residents in areas that have a history of fire is sweeping and could be a webinar in and of itself. I offer this to say that as we reduce wildfire, I think it's also important that we keep an eye on how we can reduce the risk of wildfire loss and we can increase access to the admitted markets for insurance. So what that looks like, how do we end up with an urban wildfire loss? So we have to begin going from left to right with sustained strong winds and highly receptive fuels. And these are fuels that not only have the appropriate quantity and configuration, but are available, meaning that the live and dead fuel moistures are low enough that fire can carry rapidly. And given an ignition, we see rapid fire spread through vegetation while those wind conditions last. And this is pulled from Jack Cohn's WUI disaster sequence, which was published in 2008. So this is a mechanism that is well understood. And as we see rapid fire spread through vegetation, when that wildfire encounters the built environment, a community, if you will, there is a point of transition where vegetative fire is threatening structures. And if those structures have vulnerabilities, lack of defensible space, lack of home hardening, so things like a wood shake roof, non-ember resistant vents, so 1/4 inch or greater vents, and lack of zone 0, we can see a number of homes begin to burn. And when the number of homes that are burning at a given place in time exceeds the firefighting response, the aggregation of the effective firefighting response, and we have continuity to adjacent structures. So we've ignited structures on the perimeter of a community, and those structures are less than 50 feet structure separation distant from other structures. We now have the potential for sustained urban fire spread, where fire is carried from structure to structure, where the vegetation is no longer relevant to the survival of the structure. So the challenge here is that if you are applying a wildland fire mitigation approach, defensible space and home hardening, and the home is now being threatened by an urban fire, that wildland-centric approach is no longer effective because the home is threatened by an entirely different type of fire. And the flux, measured in watts per meter squared over time, i.e. the heat that is put off by a burning structure, massively exceeds both the temperature and the duration of vegetation fire. So we have to be very, very thoughtful as we're designing our plans so that our work is aligned to the threat at that moment. So if a home is threatened by vegetation, then defensible space and home hardening are effective. But if a home is threatened by an adjacent structure, then those approaches would be ineffective. So it's important that we view not only wildfire, but our approaches to wildfire risk reduction as a network effect, as a system of systems, so that we can be effective in our allocation of limited resources, be those inspectors, be those grants or other funds, be those outreach and education. So we can identify the areas where they have the greatest effect. We can concentrate our limited resources to achieve network effects, and we can measure the result of that work. So what that looks like on the ground. So we have a community here, tightly spaced homes with exposure to vegetation on the top left side of the slide. So if we have a wildland fire approaching the community, and this is burning through the ground fire mechanism of fire spread, that is combustive vegetative item directly igniting an adjacent combustive vegetative item to spread through ground fire mechanism. As that fire approaches the community, we also have three-dimensional ember cast. So this is flaming sparks, firebrands, embers that are carried aloft by the convective column and then transported by the prevailing winds, and then have the potential to land in the community. So we have exposure here to both ground fire and to three-dimensional ember cast. And as both components, both ember and ground, encounter the built environment, if there are homes with vulnerabilities, we will see isolated structural ignitions. And as these structures begin to burn, we now create the scenario where the structures can ignite adjacent structures, or edges such as combustive vegetation or wooden fences that'll promulgate ground fire to adjacent structures. And as these homes burn, they also produce embers in their own right, further propagating three-dimensional ember cast throughout the community. And those embers, when they find either unhardened homes or receptive fuel beds, can ignite new fires. And so we begin a chain reaction. And at the same time, we now have a race between fire spread through ground component and ember cast from both vegetative and structural fuels on one hand. And on the other hand, we have the regional firefighting force. And it is a race to which one is going to achieve sufficient mass first to create a runaway equation, either a runaway equation of suppression, where the fire is contained because the firefighting resources outweigh the fire spread, or the inverse, where there is more fire than firefighters at the critical point in time. And so as we see fire spread, both direct ground component, structure to structure, ember cast from structures and vegetation, and back on the perimeter of the community, structure to structure initiated by ground component fire, we create a dilemma for the firefighting response. Which of these mechanisms should they focus on putting out? And we can quickly see fire start to spread when that fire gets into dense homes, and those homes have continuity and alignment with the prevailing winds. And so now we have surface fire spreading between structures and structure to structure and structure to edge, such as wooden fences and adjacent vegetation. And that can then trigger subsequent cascading chain reactions where very quickly the number of homes burning outweigh the firefighting response. And it is the speed with which this is occurring is the critical component. So we argue that your approach to wildfire risk reduction needs to be centered around how fast fire will arrive at the community. And then once it has arrived, how quickly it will become established in vulnerable structures and spread to the degree and with the quantity of involved structures that it outweighs your firefighting response. So what does that look like? Here we have an example of an ignition on the top right. As fire spreads, these are the fire pathways, the combination of topography, fuel, and weather that constitute the most effective or efficient route for fire to spread. And as fire spreads through both ground component and ember cast, it becomes established in the community. And I would note you have two fundamentally different mechanisms of transition here. On the top right, we have ground component directly igniting vulnerable homes on the edge. And on the bottom center, on the other side of the freeway, we have ember-caused ignitions deep within the community. And it's worthy of note that this is a horns of a dilemma problem for the firefighting response. If those homes at the top center have vulnerabilities such that they are susceptible to ignition, all of the initial firefighting response will be pulled into that area and will be fully involved trying to prevent the initial ignition of those structures. But if those homes are prepared to receive fire, they have defensible space, they have home hardening at scale, then firefighting resources are freed up to go opportunistically suppress those ember-caused ignitions deep within the community. And this ends up being a case where there was a fire, but there was no structure loss. Because while it is inevitable that there will be wildfire throughout the West and throughout fire-dependent landscapes of California, it is not also inevitable that those fires will cause community level loss. And our goal here is to move to a future in which the community can be in or adjacent to a fire perimeter without experiencing loss. And part of the way that can be done is being able to understand the mechanisms for fire spread and then deliberately and thoughtfully mitigate against those. So how do you mitigate against them? So as we talked about before, if fire encounters the community and transitions through both ground component and three-dimensional ember cast, we can start with vegetation management around the community. This is fuel breaks, splats, pods, other things that create a varied age class mosaic. But it's worth noting that work on the landscape is intended to slow, not stop the wildfire. No shortage of fires have burned over fuel breaks and other treatments on the landscape, and many communities that had fuel breaks and other treatments on the landscape have experienced devastating loss. So vegetation management, while it is an important tool, it's not the only tool, and it's only one of the domains in which we can work, and in understanding that it will slow the fire by taking a head fire and causing it to become a flanking fire. So we shouldn't be seeking to build moats in the landscape. We should be creating varied age class mosaics that form a labyrinth that the fire now has to creep its way through in a series of flanking fire movements. The next evolution we have is we can look at the hardening of parcels, that being creation of defensible space and home hardening, for those structures that are at the points of transition where ground fire will encounter the community, and defensible space and home hardening, highly effective against ground component fire. We have very, very good survival rates with homes built to the 7A standard that had effective defensible space in place. So if we carry out home hardening and defensible space, which usually will involve not only incentives but enforcement, at those points of transition, we can remove the threat posed by ground fire to the community. So now we're left with ember cast. And the defensible space and home hardening requirements that we looked at on the outlying areas are modified somewhat when we get into the interior of the community, because here the homes are going to be exposed to either embers or to adjacent structure fires. And we don't have the concern about ground fire, vegetative ground fire rolling through these areas, because there simply isn't enough contiguous vegetation to support that. So in these cases, we would want to look at targeted ember resistant measures. So that'd be a Class A roof covering or assembly. The covering is already a requirement in almost everywhere, unless your jurisdiction is still allowing untreated wood shake roofs, which I'm not aware of any that do. Retrofitting vent screens to 1/8 inch or finer, or the use of an ember resistant specific model, very inexpensive, very quick to do, and doesn't really involve a change in the architectural sense of place of the home. So usually not a particularly controversial discussion. And lastly, and unfortunately, really non-negotiable, is the creation of an ember-resistant zone 0, the removal of combustive material, both vegetative and non-vegetative, within 5 feet of the structure. This is combustible mulches, this is privets, shrubs, ground fuels, and wooden fences and gates that form edges that connect structures and allow embers to otherwise ignite a threatened home. And if that work is done, we start to take away the probability of ember cast. And then we also will look, as we prioritize this work, of where are there areas that form high propagation blocks. They are areas that are highly susceptible to ignition from embers or ground fuels and are capable of igniting many other homes. So we're really looking at continuity and potential ember distribution from those areas, such that we can land with a prioritized plan. And this really is the key takeaway from the work John and I did with the fire district, is that having an idea of how fire is going to get to town is helpful, and having an understanding of what the mitigations are is also helpful. But without a prioritization scheme, you simply will not survive the community resistance that a broad reaching and all-encompassing mitigation plan would require. Everyone should do everything everywhere is a true statement. However, it simply does not match the reality of mitigation and asking people to carry out changes on and around private property. So really critical that any plan, any work that's going to include these components has got prioritization for entry points and for propagation blocks and for areas that are going to be exposed to high-level ember wash, so that your work can be prioritized and you can gain the greatest benefit from the treatments with the least resistance. So what we're really looking for is this sweet spot where you have done work with density that brings you above the floor, represented by the minimum number needed to treat, and does not go above the ceiling, which is the point of marginal diminishing returns. And that work is spread across these 4 domains and the 5th domain, which is your firefighting response. And typically, in the absence of a plan, in the absence of a detailed understanding of the wildfire risk, we over-index on the 1st domain, which is vegetation management on the surrounding landscape, and on the 5th, which is the firefighting response. And why those 2 are critical components, if we leave out the parcel and ember hardening components in the form of defensible space and home hardening on the perimeter, and near community or near home ember resistant zone and home hardening on the interior, if we leave those out, any plan will fall short, because fire is opportunistic, and then it will exploit the weakest links in your chain. All right, so all well and good, all very simple. Let's just go do it. Unfortunately, the reality of doing things with humans and residents and the human terrain and some of the policy barriers that exist mean that this is more complex than just turning to and saying this is what we're going to do. So, John, I'll hand it to you to talk about some of the policy barriers we've
So,
encountered.
although I'm a lawyer, you're going to hear my sort of public policy side on this. If you guys were here in the flesh, I would ask you to raise your hands if you think that fire, when it burns down communities, is a bad thing. How many of you agree? And I think everybody go, yeah, sure, of course, it's kind of a no-brainer. And with Dave's clarity about the kinds of things that are important mitigations, it's like, okay, well, let's just go do it. Okay. However, the reality is it isn't happening. And as we know in government, when things don't happen, they usually don't happen for a reason. And very often that reason has sort of a political component to it. And I don't mean like running for office kind of political. So let's start with what I call the power of privates. So I grew up in Brooklyn, and so I did not know that Bushes got to vote or had any real power. But as it turns out, when you mess with people's bushes, which you do when you're talking about, in particular, things like Zone Zero, um, uh, in the suburban environment, at least, that's a big problem. So, the challenge, as many of you who are listening know, is Zone Zero, 5 foot, you know, zone that has little or nothing in it. We can debate exactly what's in it, but is wildly challenging to get to. And from a public policy perspective, and most of the people who would have to enact the legislation in order to do that, whether that be the state, which has been chewing on it, or local agencies like Moraga-Orinda Fire District, either way, it is, messing with people's privets because you're basically saying, okay, the privets that are 2 feet from your house need to now be 5 feet from your house, is a big problem. People also are very they like their, particularly in suburban environments, and that's mostly the wooey environments. They're very status quo. Almost anything can give them an excuse for why they don't want to do something. And my favorite story was we got down to the issue of dead trees. Now, you would think dead trees are kind of a clear thing you need to get rid of, right? I mean, it seems fairly obvious. And they are expensive to get rid of. But you will literally have people, and we did in one case, say, well, dead trees are good. They host woodpeckers. You need to keep dead trees. And it's like, well, sure, but even the woodpeckers aren't going to enjoy the fire. So you need to think about that. And then, there is this very broad sense too that, by the way, this typo is still there. If your home is your castle, then aren't the castle grounds yours too? What do I mean by that? I mean that there is, I think, a widespread perception that if government, for example, was willing to do your gardening for you, and by gardening I mean your fire hard, you're taking out excess fuels, etc., dead fuels, that'd be cool. We'd be okay with that. But people don't have the same sense, when your boiler breaks, when or your heater breaks, you call the repairman, you understand it's your responsibility. Um, for reasons that aren't completely clear to me, people don't have quite the same sense about the obligation to maintain their grounds in a safe condition. And so that's a challenge. So next. Next slide. So I'm only going to go over, these are about 6 different things that are policy challenges. There are more. But one of the most interesting ones concerns housing and what has become kind of a confusion between housing needs and fire concerns. So how did this all start? It started when, and it's still true, many people who are opposed to development in suburban communities, who don't want additional development, started arguing, hey, you can't develop because there's fire risk, or you can't develop in the WUI because there's fire risk. And as Dave said, this is a very important point. Housing can be built in the WUI safely if it is built to fire hardened standards with zone zero, et cetera. It can be. In fact, it may even be helpful in certain situations to form a fire fuel or fire break. However, the this fire danger got commandeered, as it were, by people who were anti-development. And this is something you need to be very careful about in how you deal with these programs and not confusing these two things. But the real bummer of the thing is recently it's turned around and the legislature has bought into the idea that those of us who were concerned about preventing these urban conflagrations through, WUI, are actually standing in the way of building housing. And so the legislature has begun to pass increasing numbers of bills that take away local authority to create new requirements based on their specific circumstances. And so I say the legislature takes the bait, and courtesy of AI, we have a little graphic here. I want to. So that's the legislature taking the bait. So anyway, so you've got a kind of a problem that's going both ways, which is that we have people who are misusing the fire danger, I think, to as an excuse for preventing development on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got the legislature now essentially preventing fire districts and other folks from legislating in a way that takes into account fire danger. And then the risk being that we end up rebuilding in places like LA not to fire hardened standards because that is perceived in some way as standing in the way of development or adding cost. And it does add some cost. But what I would say with respect to the cost issue is you also have to weigh that against insurability. And there's nothing that'll knock down the value of a property more than not having it be insurable. So next, I want to just talk a little bit about interjurisdictional issues. The fire regulation landscape is disastrously bad in California and maybe elsewhere. I don't know. I don't know outside of California. But, Dave talks about the varied age-graded fuel mosaic. Well, I would say we have a kind of a varied age-graded legislative regulatory patchwork in California. You have many very big special districts, particularly park districts, things like that, that are not necessarily well regulated or even capable of being regulated well by the folks who have to put out the fires in those places. You have a tremendous amount of dysfunction at the CAL FIRE and Board of Forestry level. We've been counting on them to adopt, they were in fact directed by the legislature to adopt the Zone Zero regulations. I think that was what's supposed to have happened 2 or 3 years ago, Dave, right?
January 1st, 2023.
Yeah, and has not happened yet. We're now here that's supposed to be happening in January 1 of this year, but all internal indications are that won't happen this coming year, that is, and that all internal indications are they're going to fail at that as well. The result of that, as well-meaning as it may have been, is it took all the steam, all the wind out of local efforts to develop Zone Zero because everybody was counting on the state doing it. And of course, if the state does it, that takes a lot of pressure off of the local electeds who, again, this is a politically very difficult issue with Zone Zero. And then you have, for example, a lot of fire districts. Moraga-Orinda is a good example, although I'm not calling out any of the cities that are in Moraga-Orinda as particular problems. We have a great relationship with them. But whether you have a great relationship or not, you have these tremendous overlapping responsibilities between the cities and the fire districts and who's responsible for getting information out, tremendous public confusion about whose rules are whose, a lot of resistance from, one group about putting out the message of the other group, et cetera. So, and this is just, I'm shorthanding just a tremendous number of overlapping problems that make it very hard. And what I would say, I have a simple solution that needs to occur, which is whoever is responsible for suppressing fire should have the ability to regulate the conditions in the place that they are suppressing. And is basically my very simplistic answer. And that just is not the case in the way fire regulation is handled in California. All right, next slide. And then three more I just want to mention. The state inaction again. This goes beyond obviously the issue of Zone 0. It goes back to the issue of the fire maps. Many of you who are listening are probably aware of the fact that that it took the state from, I think the last time they issued them was what, 2007? And then they finally got them out this year after, it was supposed to be every 5 years, right? And it was literally 20 years. Which, in the meantime, a lot of building took place, a lot of not necessarily to fire hardened standards in places that probably should have been. And then in addition to that, there are some real limitations in what the state has issued, and it's not necessarily their fault, but what the state has issued is being taken as kind of the gospel of where risk really exists, and that is a more complicated issue.
John, if I could briefly, and I'd say with regard to land use planning and the state fire hazard severity zone maps, the operative word there is hazard. And I would note that the intent of the maps and the thing they're designed for is for land use planning and understanding which part of the building code, the fire code, and then Title 19 should be applied for land use planning. And the maps, from a hazard perspective, I think are generally very good. The challenge has been is that they are often used interchangeably as a risk map, which they explicitly are not, because they are the only map that is present, and that in the absence, in the vacuum that is created by a local risk map and a local understanding of the topography, weather, and fuel conditions that will come together to bring fast-moving fire into the community, then folks naturally misuse those hazard maps as a risk map. So I do think it is worth noting that the maps are widely misused, and that's not necessarily the state's fault. They have produced a hazard map, which is what they were tasked with doing, and others are then using it as a risk map. And those are two very different things. And I would just ask folks to make sure you're carefully reviewing how you are using those maps to ensure you're not using them for something they were not intended.
Yeah, and this goes to, I'll put a little plug in for something that Dave and others do, which is really local communities need to have much more specific modeling around issues like fire pathways and things like that in order to really understand what we sometimes refer to as the mitigations that matter, which is something we'll be dealing with in one of our later episodes here. Last two things. One is the tragedy of the commons, which, one of the real problems is, there are certainly people who are willing to do the right thing on their property. But obviously, in a private property world that we live in, the person next to them might not. And one of the real challenges here is, at least with respect to insurability, but also effectiveness, one property is unlikely to do very much. And so you really need, and this is why, legislative approaches, regulatory approaches to this issue are necessary, right? Because it isn't enough to just get volunteers, basically. It just isn't going to really, bend the curve on insurability or safety. And then finally, the enforcement challenge. So, when you have a good regulatory environment, you've put the right regulations in place, et cetera, you still have to get enforcement. You still have to get people to do these things. And that does involve enforcement. And one of the real challenges is, at least in the fire area, that enforcement makes enemies. And we are, local democracies are democracies. They're elected bodies, and they're really not very good at holding the line and enforcing because they're under so much pressure from constituents, and especially when you've got areas of mass, not being in conformance with rules, et cetera. It's very, very hard to move the needle, and yet enforcement is absolutely critical and is, not there is not a great deal of enforcement going on in California. Overall, Cal Fire does not do very much enforcement at all. Moraga-Orinda, proud to say, was a real leader in the enforcement area. But it continues to, and again, if you have a special purpose district like a fire district, um, I think they generally are a little better at this sort of thing because you have a board that's elected for a single purpose. They're not elected, for all these other purposes. They don't have a million constituencies. Everybody expects them to do it. But even there, it can be very, very challenging. And, it's challenging also because the kind of mitigations we're talking about do cost money in some cases, particularly, things like dead trees are very expensive to deal with. And so, it can be very, very hard to motivate people to make the changes. I mean, I remember one example we had of somebody who we could not access the front of their property because they had a locked gate. And I called that person up and I said, it's a violation, blah, blah, blah. There has to be a key to the gate, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, can't you just pull the gate down if we have a fire? And it's like, well, how about you just give us a key? So I mean, these are the kinds of things that you deal with. In any event, that's just a quick overview of some of the policy and legislative and political barriers to the kind of regulation that we're talking about.
And John, if I could add two additional points. The inverse of the tragedy of the commons in this case, if we're using economic theory, would be the public goods game, where everyone benefits, but who will bear the cost? And so in this case, there is a very real concern the residents can raise, residents at the perimeter of the community who are being asked to do the work, to say, wait a minute, isn't the entire community benefiting from the work I am doing? And so there's a trade-off there that certainly has to be navigated. And then with regard to the enforcement challenges I mentioned earlier, it just really highlights the need for prioritization to ensure that the pain you are enduring for going through enforcement is matched to both the geographic extent that will be effective and to the standard that will be effective. If you're carrying out enforcement that does not include Zone 0 and is not coupled to a voluntary home hardening incentive program, because we can't require retrofits to the building itself, then it's likely to be ineffective. And you can end up in this unhappy middle where you have almost all of the pain and almost none of the benefit. And just really suggesting that be very thoughtful about where the risk is, what's the mechanism of fire spread, what are the mitigations that will match the risk at that point, and will have the appropriate extent and to the appropriate standard to be effective.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for those presentations. I think this is a really good context setting for the rest of the conversations we're going to have. But I do want to get to a few of these questions that have come in during this conversation. First, Dave, something that you were just recently talking about, we got a clarifying question. Could you speak a little more to the difference between the risk map and the hazard map that you were just pointing out? Are not the same.
So as a general statement, hazard is the thing, risk is the probability of loss occurring. And specifically to the maps, a CAL FIRE hazard severity zone map does not account for mitigations because it is intended to be a 50-year land use planning tool. So if you are in an area that is a high fire hazard severity zone or a very high fire hazard severity zone, there's nothing you can do to change that designation other than building new construction with fire adaptation that would push the vegetative edge farther from the homes. In contrast to that, a risk map can account for the mitigations, first thing. Second thing, is that the hazard map just uniformly says this is where there could be fire. A risk map can be the combination of the specific factors that would bring fast-moving fire to a point of entry, specifically the pathway and the entry point. So you can then work back both upstream and downstream to design mitigations around that. Obviously, if you look at a fire hazard severity zone map where all areas are essentially treated equal within the same geography, you do not see any sub-identification areas that have the risk of initiating urban fire. It would be a very, very blunt tool to use for your prioritization exercise.
Okay, so essentially one is more of a long-range land use planning tool and one really more accounts for mitigation efforts in your jurisdiction. I'm going to oversimplify what you just said.
Yeah, so
Okay.
prioritization and then valuing. You can see the value of the work with a risk map, where with a hazard map, no amount of mitigations will change the hazard.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that clarification. And then a follow-up question I think just came in is the hazard map required?
Yes, CAL FIRE. So this is from the Public Resource Code in SRA, and then Government Code 51175 to 51177 in LRA. The state identifies, local agency adopts or designates maps, and it is a requirement that be done. The operative language in Government Code 51177 is local agency shall.
Something you both mentioned, but has come up a number of times in these questions, which I don't think will surprise you, is Zone 0. Are you guys aware, either of you, of any updates on the progress made there? I know we've talked about a couple of deadlines that have passed, but any updates on what those, on that timeline, or what that might entail?
Yeah, very briefly, AB 3049 or 79 passed by Friedman in 2020 created Zone 0 and tasked the Board of Forestry with establishing a regulation for its implementation no later than January 1st, 2023. For a number of reasons, that deadline has come and gone. And then in January of this year, in response to the LA fires, the governor issued an executive order that, among other things, directed the Board of Forestry to complete the regulation and rulemaking process by the end of this calendar year. The next hearing of the Board of Forestry on this topic is scheduled for September 18th. The agendas were just published this morning, just before this webinar. I'd encourage folks to either participate or to follow along. Of note, included in the current language, which the Board of Forestry is considering, is a paragraph that says a local agency may consider local conditions. The challenge there, of course, is that for a number of reasons, this goes to the California Constitution and rights that revert to charter cities, et cetera. The local agency cannot adopt a standard that falls below a state minimum on areas that have not been identified as a municipal affair. Per Government Code 51175, in this case, wildfire is explicitly not a municipal affair. So the Board of Forestry has language in the current draft that I think incorrectly, I defer to everyone's either city attorney or district council, but incorrectly suggests to a layperson that a local agency could adopt a less restrictive standard to meet local conditions. That's not my reading of the relevant portions of the state constitution and the law. That is worth following with great care how that moves forward. The Board of Forestry has also, obviously the final reg will be the final reg, but there has been some movement on the ability to maintain mature trees in Zone 0 if the canopy is above the roof. So the bole or the trunk of the tree can be within 5 feet as long as the canopy is trimmed up so that it is above the roof line. That obviously will be a significant change with regard to how impactful implementation of of Zone 0 is with regard to cost and to some of the concerns about cooling and shading. However, for the stuff on the ground, so for ground cover, both mulch and other combustive ground cover, growth on the ground, and near home shrubs and privets, the fire science is really damning and is essentially non-negotiable that if you have any of those things or you have a wooden fence in Zone 0, you significantly increase the probability of the home igniting. That said, we are waiting to see what comes out of this the next hearing the board holds, and looking forward to the board publishing the standard no later than the end of the year as directed by the executive order.
Perfect, thank you. And we can find a link to that hearing, that information, and send that out in our follow-up note with the rest of the materials for folks that are interested in attending that next week. We did get a number of policy questions. I want to see if I can get to one or two of these. As agencies are updating, their general plans or things like that, are there specific policies that they can be considering that might help reduce wildfire risk or mitigate some of these issues we've been talking about?
Yes, there are. And I think the specific elements go back to what we've discussed earlier today, and we'll discuss in more detail in the upcoming webinars. Inserting language saying wildfire is a risk and should be considered will not reduce the risk. And no plan has ever protected a home or put out a fire. So I would suggest that in your general plan and in the safety element, be very specific about understanding what the risk is, what are the component parts, and be equally specific in identifying the mitigation measures and the associated timeline. These things take time. They don't just happen overnight. These are big ships. They turn slowly, but we have to start turning them at some point. And my experience suggests that more often than not, residents will take as long as they are given to carry out mitigations, and that postponing deadlines for many will just mean postponing when the work begins. And there is a question about the opportunity cost of foregoing the benefit, the net present value of a mitigation today against the impact to asking residents to move quickly. There's a trade-off there. The current, to speaking to Board of Forestry's work on Zone Zero as an example, under the current language, anything the Board of Forestry adopts this year won't go into effect for existing structures until 2029, 9 full years after the requirement was generated. So at some point, how much loss are we willing to accept, or risk we're willing to accept today by deferring the value of those mitigations? And with regard to general plans, I would suggest a regional view of the problem, and then macro view of the wildfire risk, and then micro view of where the mitigations are going to be carried out and to what standard.
Yeah, unfortunately, fortunately, these things don't stop at jurisdictional boundaries, right? So thinking about that regional coordination, and to John's point, the overlapping agencies that are involved, even within your jurisdictional boundaries, whether that's the county or special districts. So I appreciate you mentioning that from that regional or interjurisdictional approach, because I think that that's a very important piece of this conversation. I am just doing a quick time check. We don't have a ton of time, but we did get a couple of questions that are related to folks looking for examples of places that are doing this well in terms of having both the hazard and risk maps available, moving towards defensible space inspection programs and things like that. So I can work with John and Dave offline and see if we can pull some examples together of those to share with you all again in that follow-up email. And we will be having local government representatives join us for the rest of these conversations, so you'll be able to hear directly from some of your colleagues that are doing work in this space as well. So I just wanted to make that note. But just a couple of closing slides. Dave, I'll just have you run through these for me if you don't mind, instead of toggling back and forth. Just a quick reminder, we've been talking about this throughout today, but again, this is just the first in a series of conversations. So please keep your eye out for these additional sessions. They're going to dive deeper into some of these policy components that we've been talking about at a high level today. So I hope that you guys will join us for one or more of these additional sessions. And then you go to the next slide. If you aren't already connected to our network at ILG, please join our newsletter list or follow us on social media. That is another way that you'll hear about these additional sessions in this series, as well as additional webinars or trainings or resources that we put out on this topic or others in our broad scope. And then lastly, just wanted to share a reminder that we are recording the webinar today, and we will be sharing that electronically, as well as the slide deck and some of these other resources that we just mentioned. And the last slide is just our contact information. If you want to follow up with any of us offline, I know we weren't able to obviously get to the breadth of questions that came in today, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you have follow-up questions or want to connect. So with that, I just want to thank you all for spending part of your morning with us. We really appreciate the conversation and the questions. And I also want to thank John and Dave for sharing their expertise on this really important topic, and excited that this is just the beginning of the conversation. John or Dave, any final thoughts before we close out for today?
Thank you for having us. I appreciate everyone's participation. I would just suggest this problem isn't going to solve itself. It's going to get much worse left to its own devices. And unlike other perils, this is one we have the agency to mitigate. We can create communities, both new construction and retrofit of existing construction, that can survive exposure to wildfire. It's just a matter of will to act. And I would challenge everybody, if not now, then when.
And I want to thank you guys again, ILG. You guys do, great work, and we're very, very happy to participate in this, and excited about the coming sessions.
Perfect. Well, I hope everybody has a great afternoon. We look forward to seeing you on the next one.